Hello, I'm Corey Newton, and I'm going to explain why I wrote a book. The reason I wrote Constitutional Capitalism and Common Defense is because I feel the United States is suffering from severe economic malpractice and severe strategic malpractice. And I had to get it out of my head, I had to get it out of my system, I had to set the stage and set the table for what is to come. So I got another one brewing, it's already outlined, all I have to do is fill it in. But let me explain this one now. Constitutional Capitalism, Common Defense. I dusted off the production possibilities frontier, which you see before you. Now this is an economic model found in the first 2-3 chapters of every microeconomic and macroeconomic textbook. So it's usually set up, y-axis has something like apples, x-axis has something like oranges, or pizza and hamburgers, or guns and butter. The thing that always struck me about the PPF, Production Possibilities Frontier, was that it took into account the rules of the game. Now the rules of the game, where do we get those from? Where do we get the rules of our economic game from? There's 4 sources that we get the rules of the game from. The first is the Constitution of the United States. The second are statutes and legislation. The third are administrative regulations. And the fourth is judicial precedents. So what I did, I burned through one of a couple versions of Constitution I have. I burned through it and I tried to identify all of the constitutionally authorized interventions into economic activity. And I found them. I found a whole bunch of them. I found a whole bunch of them. I put them in I got multiple appendices. So the first one you'll see on the top of the y-axis is general administration and general economic rules. We also have constitutionally authorized authorizations for public goods and services. We also have constitutional authorization for military goods and services. Now social insurance at the bottom, down here, is authorized through statutes, administrative regulations, and judicial precedents. So that's how I set it up. I set it up just like that. So the Constitution authorizes the top 3, statutes, administrative regulations, judicial precedents authorize social insurance. Now how do we pay for these? These just don't happen. How do we pay for all this stuff? Well, we tax the proceeds and the profits of the production and the consumption of capital goods and services and consumer goods and services. Now I left that broad so that way it encompasses everything. Everything you can buy, everything you can make, everything you can produce, everything you consume can fall into either a capital good or service or a consumer good and service. So once those are produced, they get taxed. They basically get taxed to pay for everything on the x-axis. So right away you see trade-offs. The more of the x-axis you have down here, the less of the y-axis you can have. So if you have all capital goods and services, consumer goods and services, you're going to have less of the other one. So it has to be somewhere in here. This is your basic starting point of your political economy of the United States. And I used Adam Smith's definition of political economy, the mechanism by which the people can enrich themselves and the sovereign can be enriched. That's a political economy I'm talking about. And that's what I've illustrated here on the PPF. This PPF just sits in microeconomic textbooks and macroeconomic textbooks in the first couple of chapters, and then it's left alone and you get off into academic economic wasteland. Well, let's break it down realistically. Let's break it down realistically. And the reason I use a PPF is because it specifically takes into account the rules of the game and behavior. The behavioral side, which is ignored by mainstream economists because they're so busy to have an empirical foundation or quantitative foundation for their projections. What do they have to do that? They hold everything else constant. They say ceteris paribus, everything else constant. And that doesn't reflect human behavior, human action. It has nothing to do with it. And they do that in order to quantify a bunch of numbers and statistics to manipulate the population to say, oh, we're on this side. But it does not take into account the indirect effects and the unintended consequences of human behavior. Now, how do we expand the production possibilities frontier right here. Rules of the game. Improvements of the rules of the game will expand. Technological innovation will expand. Resource availability will expand. Increases in capital stock will expand the production possibilities frontier. What constitutional capitalism says is that we can specifically use the rules of the game. We can change and improve the rules of the game to increase technological innovation, increase resource availability, and increase capital stock. Now, any one of these that increases or improves will expand and create economic growth outward. If we specifically use the rules of the game to increase all three, we're going to have an expansion that we need, because exponential growth in cost and debt is occurring in the general administration, public goods and services, military goods and services, and social insurance. So the question I pose in here is, what level of exponential economic growth do we need on the y-axis with the capital goods and consumer services to offset the exponential growth of cost and debt in general administration, public goods and services, military goods and services, and social insurance? And that is a question I defy any single one of the two-party idiocracy that controls every level of our government to answer. What is the answer to that question? Now, we answer it here. We try to answer it here. Now, we've shown improvements of the rules of the game, increases in capital stock, increases in resource availability, and increases in technological innovation can expand it outward. And these are the reasons why they say, oh, no, we cannot do that. Market failures. That's huge in economics. It's completely misguided. I explain why it's misguided in here. Externalities is your basic contamination. Okay, we've produced a good, we have a toxic byproduct that's value is zero. Now, we can either spend money to dispose of it properly in accordance with regulations, or we can just dump it in the back. Okay, they go ahead and dump it in the back. A third party, the guy who lives next door, his well's contaminated, all his garden dies, so he has a cost. A third party incurs a cost from a transaction they had nothing to do with. So externalities are serious, and there needs to be a balance between them. There's got to be a legitimate balance where each side can say, okay, what are the efficiency benchmarks we need to have production, and what are the environmental benchmarks we need to protect the third party from getting negatively affected by such a thing. Redistribution, this is something that right-wingers, Tea Party, wannabe public finance economists are screaming and yelling about. Okay, redistribution is not going away because it's written into the Constitution. The Constitution specifically authorizes the provision of public goods and services, military goods and services, and general administration, as well as the other things that have been built up by social insurance. So you can argue the extent of redistribution that's efficient and effective and necessary and proper, but redistribution is never going away. The same with inequality. The people on the left who want to be public finance economists and Occupy Wall Street, for example, oh, inequality, it's okay. You can argue what levels are appropriate, what levels are necessary and proper, what can we do to minimize it. You will always have inequality, because of division of labor. Not everyone can be the chairman of the board. Not everyone is going to be stuck cleaning out the sewer. And your wages are based on your productivity, and we really get into that a little bit in here too. So these items in red are pressures upon the production possibilities frontier of the United States from expanding and creating that level of exponential economic growth on the y-axis to offset and to pay for the exponential level of growth of cost and debt in the x-axis. Now, here we see what happens with improvements of the rules of the game, increases in capital stock, increases in resource availability, increases in technological innovation can push the production's possibilities frontier outward and to the right. Here we see the growth. Now think of this as pie. Think of this as a piece of pie. Do you want to grow the pie? Or do you want to leave the pie here and cut it up into slices and redistribute it? Here we go. Redistribution right here. We're not going to grow. We're going to have all these pressures that say we can't have expansion and growth, and we're going to redistribute everything. And that's the dilemma we are in now. That's why everything's flat. That's why you have all these policies and all this conflict between them, because it's a bitter power struggle for the control of the welfare state, which we were never meant to be. Independence and sovereignty. So this is a system of checks and balances between the constitutionally authorized goods and services, military, public, general administration. What always occurs when people have unlimited wants and needs, the production of capital goods and services and consumer goods and services. And what are we as a country? Are we independent and sovereign? You cannot have a level of economic growth that diminishes or erodes your independence and sovereignty. You can't do it. Just in the same manner, you can't have capital goods and services and consumer goods and services out of control that go against general administration, public goods and services, military goods. We got to be able to throw it out of bounds. And I think I've developed a way, a revolutionary and paradigm-shifting way to do that through the production possibilities frontier, taking the production possibilities frontier from your microeconomic or your macroeconomic textbook that's got a bunch of dust on it, knocking it off. What does the Constitution say about how it runs, and balance it with our independence and sovereignty? We need to check and balance all of these against each other. We need to check and balance. You can take any economic issue, put it on the PPF, and you can find a rational economic solution within the PPF, within the context of constitutional capitalism. And that's why I wrote the book, because I couldn't take it being up here anymore, and nobody understands and nobody knows about how to get it out. Now, we're going to go ahead and see what happens when you have market failures, externalities, redistribution, and inequality slamming against the PPF and contracting it inwards. It contracts inwards. Now, at flight, capital flight, let's look at tax inversions. Let's look at Burger King moving around their stock, acquiring a company in Canada where the tax rate is lower. So now, what we talked about that can expand the PPF, increases in capital stock, increases in resource availability, and increases in technological innovation are now being put in other economies and not in the United States, and that's because of the rules of the game. You could say, oh, Burger King are traitors, we're going to boycott them, but it was a rational economic decision for them to leave. They expected more benefits and costs to be associated with them leaving, so that they left. And it happens again and again and again with the free trade policies and the outsourcing policies. And this all happens because of the pressures that prohibit increases in capital stock, increases in resource availability, and increases in technological innovation, because of the rules of the game are preoccupied with market failures, externalities, redistribution, and inequality. Here it goes. Here they go more. The neoliberal economic international order set up after World War II says certain things. It says we need to knock down trade barriers, we need to open up borders, we need to have this whole free-flowing movement of capital and everything else. Globalization is a result of that. And the result of globalization is the PPF is contracted and capital flees to emerging economies where the increases occur there instead of here. And we end up with a service-based economy that's not very productive. And that's why wages are flat or falling. And corporate profits are so up because they're bouncing out. They're leaving. And that's the balance, the check and balance between what the Constitution says, what's good for the economy, and what's good for independence and sovereignty. And you can see the stress, the friction, and tension built into this whole thing. And this tries to cut through it. I'm trying to cut through it and maximize the economy in the United States, the Constitution in the United States, and the independence and sovereignty in the United States. And here, this is a situation we're in right now, September 9th, 2014. Capital is fleeing, our PPF is contracting, and all this pieces of pie, instead of growing the pie outward, it's just being contracted and redistributed. And it's very terrible. You look at what they offer. You look at the two-party idiocracy, what they offer. All they offer is fiscal and monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy kicked off in 1913 with the income tax, the 16th Amendment. Monetary policy kicked off in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. They've had 100 years. They've run their course. They're out of ideas. They're out of everything. We're up against a wall with debt, cost, exponentially growing. What else can they do? How much are they really going to cut? How much can they really grow? That's why I offered this to undo the damage of the last 100 years, to shift the paradigm and bring it home to where it should be, where it was intended to be, rational.